Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Rubal Kanozia, and namaste to all of you there in India and wherever it is that you're watching from. It's about 8:40 in the morning on a Thursday here in Texas. And the background you see there, which is a virtual background, is really my campus. I'm really honored to be amongst you, and I know it's evening or night in India. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really delighted to be among very distinguished scholars, educators, and practitioners. As I listened to the two previous speakers, I was taking notes because I find quite a lot of similarities between what you've shared and what I am going to share. So it's not going to be totally a surprise. And from the practitioner's perspective, very interesting things that we as scholars can learn. In fact, just yesterday, I'm part of a commission for public relations education in the United States. And one of the things we talked about was the importance of bringing together practitioners and scholars so we can learn from each other, so that our research in the academy would have utility for the practitioners, and practitioners would come to us as well to find out how they could utilize strategies and tactics to make their jobs better. So it was such a delight for me to listen to the speakers and actually see these kinds of things in practice. And I'm going to share my screen now because I have some PowerPoints that I would like for you to see while I'm speaking as well. So if you would please permit me to do that, that'll be much appreciated. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
You can see. Yes. Yeah, yes.
Perfect. Wonderful. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So we've all heard this term and we're all now very familiar with it. Disinformation, misinformation, infodemic, fact, fake news. And we often hear that a lot from politicians. Someone publishes something or says something that they don't like. They say it's fake news. It's a catch-all for what they don't want to talk about. But of course, there is real fake news. There is real disinformation, and there is real misinformation, okay? These terms have really gotten into our lexicon. Fake news and misinformation have become the norm. They've been normalized. And this normalization has created the new global crisis that the WHO calls infodemic, which I'm going to refer to subsequently later on. It's called infodemic of misinformation. So we hear the terms bandied around, disinformation, misinformation, but what do they really mean? As you can see, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know that disinformation is essentially false information with intent to mislead. So it is deliberate. It is used by just about governments, by organizations, by rivals, because the intent is to deliberately mislead the public. While on the other hand, misinformation is false information that is spread with or without the intention to mislead. And people oftentimes confuse both. So there is one, disinformation with intent to mislead, and misinformation with or without intent to mislead. And then there is malinformation, information that is based on reality, but is used to cause harm to an individual, to an organization, to a country. And we're going to see how these play out in the world today, but particularly as it relates to COVID, because that is what we're talking about today. And of course, rumors, that's been around for a long, long time. okay, unconfirmed statements that changes, the story changes as it goes from one person to the next. And in the process, it's of course embellished. Well, infodemics, and this is a WHO definition, is the excessive amount of both accurate and inaccurate information. It is deliberately done to simply confuse. And that creates a problem. It creates a problem to the recipients. Now, here we are in this forum, well educated, we can decipher things, right? We can read, we can make the decision to verify, but not everybody does that, and not everybody has the wherewithal to do that. So infodemics is a problem. It is a peril of misinformation, particularly at times like this, with the management of disease outbreaks such as the pandemic that we find ourselves facing. So a plethora of accurate information combined deliberately, I might add, with information that is not accurate, designed to simply confuse people and make them start questioning themselves and questioning the information that they get from legitimate sources. And that's where we find ourselves. Now, as I listen to you talk about India, I'm sure we're all on the same planet. You've also been reading about what has been taking place here in the United States, particularly at the beginning and even now to an extent. I live in Texas. We've had our own issues with all of this. In fact, some colleagues and I just did a study, which we haven't published yet, on messaging. Okay, messaging that came from the government confused with messaging that came from folks with whatever intent, whatever goals they had in mind. And that could be very, very confusing for the average person. So the term infodemics is a perfect catch-all for that kind of information. Now, take a look at some of the things that we are now familiar with in this COVID era. Different kinds of false information, mischaracterizing the disease or the protective measures that are needed. And as I listen to Professor Singh Dugal, he really captured that. And so people get all kinds of descriptions about what and what COVID isn't. That leads to tremendous confusion. Then there is a false treatment or medical interventions, and everybody is an expert. They heard it or they got the information from their sister's brother's friend who's a doctor and nurse in some faraway places. We saw all of that play out during that period. Or the scapegoating of people or groups of people. Here in the United States, some people with an Asian background, particularly with Chinese background, were accosted. In some cases, they were harmed because some people believe that, they were associated with COVID, even though they live here and had absolutely nothing to do with it. So we see what false information can lead to. And of course, the big ones, conspiracy theories, mixing existence or origin of the pandemic, mixing that with politics or religion. Very, very dangerous. And we see that happening. And by the way, this information, you can look that up from the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security. Again, we live this and we continue to live this when one mixes politics and religion with health issues, which has led to a lot of people, quite a number of people, unwilling to get vaccinated because they believe the vaccine is made from tissues of aborted fetuses. And that is very dangerous, obviously, when one mixes religion and politics with health information. So what is it that enables this misinformation? Let's take a look at some really genuine reasons. And this information is from WHO. But as you listen, as you read this, it makes sense. You think of the traditional business model. It has completely changed. So let's say, for instance, a typical newspaper that is no longer being able to publish because no one is reading it. So it's gravitated completely online, and advertising revenues have been reduced, but they still need readership so they can capture some of the advertising revenues that are going to other sources. So we see the use of clickbait, a headline that would make people click to read the story, and it turns out the story is quite different from the headlines. And then you see again, because of budgets or for a variety of reasons, that news organizations are not able to keep trained journalists. So they have reduced quality control, because it's all a matter of populating the site with content, verified or not verified. Of course, there is the issue of digital transformation of newsroom and storytelling, and it causes journalists as well as non-journalists to basically create content, and that limits their ability to check, the traditional training that one gets in journalism: check facts, check facts, check facts before one publishes. That is kind of gray. There are lots of gray areas in that. And then, of course, the creation of new ecosystem, whereby anyone can create their own content. Anyone can create their own website and populate it or attract readers who think the same way. So it's an echo chamber, and they can, through those channels, spread inaccurate, false, malicious information. And there's nothing anyone can do about it, because the folks who are part of that help to spread it. As Mr. Kumar had mentioned, the professionals take the information to the local people, they write it in their local language and voice it and get it out there. People also use that format in getting not very nice things done, as we can see here. So how does this misinformation spread? Of course, with the click of a mouse. Something happens in India, the next minute, someone gets that information, posts it online. Before you know it, we all read about it within minutes. I follow a lot of news from India because I have a lot of Indian friends, including Dr. Ruben Kanosia. So I follow anything about India. I'm very, very interested. Okay, so the internet and social media has made the spread of news, of fake news and misinformation easier. And it provides that rush for people to publish and be the first to transit information right away. And it makes it also easy for people to use this disinformation for political or economic gains. So misinformation, of course, arises when there is a gap. And as Mr. Kumar mentioned, we want to get in there before that gap becomes bigger. So you get in there as a practitioner by providing accurate information, which is absolutely brilliant, because if that is not done, people tend to seek information to fill that gap. And the information that they get from people who create their own websites with inaccurate information could be information that is detrimental to them. So misinformation spreads primarily through social media and, of course, other channels. But as Mr. Kumar mentioned, if we get in there with the accurate information ahead of time, we can deal with that. Not 100%, but make a huge effort in dealing with that. So here is something that we all are very familiar with, not just in India, but all over the world and in the United States. When COVID happened, many different groups propagated their information online. What it did was that it created a problem for the government in responding immediately, in responding to contradict all of the false informations that were out there. And also there were situations where, and I would use my country, I would use United States as an example, where in some cases, not only did the government not act very quickly, they also provided contradictory information. And that is confusing. So you think of this situation where we're dealing with a pandemic, and people are getting false narrative, contradictory narrative from the WHO, from the local health department, from different groups with different interests. For the average person, it can be very, very confusing. For you and me, we can make a deliberate effort to look for the truth, but for most people, it's very confusing. And so one can understand, and that's something that I've shared on different platforms, one can understand why people can get confused as to what to do. And then it is our job as media experts and professionals to guide them to the right information, and also to make that information simple and easy for them to understand. So because initially there was this gap in information, all kinds of crazy things came up. And I'm sure you probably had your own share in India. People were concerned and said that the 5G technology had something to do with COVID. And people were told from different websites, even our own former president, as I'm sure you all read about, had his own suggestions as to what people could do. I'm not going to go into the details because you can read about it. So people had all those kinds of crazy, what appeared to be crazy ideas about COVID, the origin of COVID, the causes of COVID, and what people could do about it. And that kind of disinformation circulating online, shared and spread, created this avalanche of confusion for the average person, and the kind of confusion that is very dangerous. Okay, so what are some of the suggestions about this? As I mentioned, even our own former president gave some not scientific advice. I'm sure you read about it. Suggestions for people to drink bleach or chlorine. And people actually did drink bleach or chlorine and ended up in hospital. Some suggested that, have a combination of garlic, lemon, some home remedy posted and promoted by various websites that are unverified. People actually did that. Or that masks were not effective. People actually did that. Or you can't stop people from gathering in closed spaces without masks, without vaccination, without any kind of preventive measures. People actually did that. And of course, we read about the consequences. People actually died as well. Okay, so what are the strategies? Again, I heard Professor Dougal mention some really, really good ones, and I'll just simply add to that. First, go to sites that are trusted. Here in this country, of course, we check our local health department, coronavirus.gov. In your home country, could be the Ministry of Health. Look for reliable sources. Look for the experts. Check the source of information. Is this reliable? Think before you share, which is something that as individuals we could do. I'm sure, like you, I get all the time, sometimes from family members, from friends, oh, you should do this, about Corona. And I email them and I remind them, I can read for myself. I'm sure that I can look up information for myself. So it's very important for us to think before we share and to get that information out there, to not be an unwitting partner in disinformation by retweeting or sharing information, and to report information, false information, to the social media platforms. Well, of course, Facebook has come under tremendous scrutiny for not doing right during the intense period of Corona. And it is obviously making some efforts, but it's very important to do what we can on a personal basis, on an individual basis, and to educate those around us. But what about at the global level? news literacy is very important. And all of us here are in media, knowing how the news media works, including journalistic standards, which continues to go down because of what I mentioned earlier. You know, advertising revenues are down, and there's the use of clickbait to get people to read. And also advertising literacy. Now, these are all grand global scale computer literacy, but at the same time, while we know about these things, we can talk about it in an intellectual, wonderful forum such as this. Well, what about the average person in the village who has no idea what computer literacy is all about, or advertising literacy? What do we do with them? What do we do? How do we get them to understand? It goes back to what Mr. Kumar said, okay? We use people that they can relate to get the messages across to them. So while we can look at strategies and tactics on a global, larger scale, we have to start from within. We have to start from the narrow perspective. We have to start from a narrow angle and then move on. And then this is the latest thing. This is the very current research. This research publication came out early this year on data science. By the way, data science has always existed, but it is now used in this context to look at how to counter misinformation and disinformation in this COVID era. So what is data science? Some of you are probably familiar with it. It's really a combination of different areas of science: sociology, computer science, math, and physics. Basically, to use this and create an AI, artificial intelligence, that can easily detect disinformation. Now, it is still in the early stages, okay? The belief by the researchers is that when all of this is combined, it would create a very, very powerful tool to potentially restrain the propagation of disinformation and misinformation. But it still does not take away from the important role that we as individuals, as professors, as media educators, as media practitioners can take to ensure that, as Mr. Kumar rightly mentioned, from the grassroots level, we begin educating people to recognize what is disinformation, what is misinformation, how do you identify it? And how do you counter it from a very personal level, individual level, before we get into this AI thing that would look at the vast amount of information that is available online? We have to start from the beginning. We have to start from grassroots. But this is a very interesting area that would have to deal with AI, because as we all, that would use AI rather to deal with misinformation. It is a tough challenge. It'll be very interesting to see how all of this plays out. So my question, I always end with this: how do you counter misinformation? It is not a black and white issue. It is not something that's going to get solved tomorrow or in the next few years, but it will take a calculated effort on a global level and at a micro level, starting with individuals.